Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 2 of your Bish Therapist podcast. I am Melissa Reich, your Bish Therapist. This podcast is hosted by me, a real life therapist turned pop culture enthusiast. For those of you who are new listeners, welcome. Just announced my podcast yesterday on Amy Phillips' show, and it's been a real whirlwind ever since. So being aware of the fact that I have a lot of new listeners, I'm going to, each episode kind of just reiterate who I am and, explain what this podcast is all about. So what the podcast is about is your Bish therapist giving you very hot takes and clinical interpretations of observable behavior in the media. So Bravo, true crime, I'm really here for all of it. Now, today, this is a very, very special episode of your Bish therapist. I am going to cover part 1, 2, and 3 of the podcast with Bethenny and Rachel Leviss. I had so many thoughts after part 1 that I tried doing a post and it just didn't do it justice. So I wanted to really devote an entire episode to each part of this interview. For me, I feel this is such an important topic to focus on because so much was talked about in terms of mental health and advocacy and HIPAA, which clearly Rachel is not aware of what HIPAA is. So what I am going to do is explain today my clinical interpretations and thoughts of the interview parts 1, 2, and 3. I'm going to give you a broad strokes overview of my initial impressions. I am going to go into specific things that were said in part 1, 2, and 3 of the interview and share a little bit about, as I said, talk about mental health advocacy. What does that actually mean? I'm going to define HIPAA and explain what that is. And this is no shade because for practitioners like myself, HIPAA is something that's important for us to be aware of. Not everybody has an understanding of HIPAA. So fair enough. I'm going to explain that. I've seen a lot of confused people online and a lot of people wanting me to discuss this. So here I am. This podcast today, I'm just going to talk until I'm done. And, normally I want to try to keep podcasts pretty bite-sized, digestible pieces because, listen, we all have a lot of podcasts we listen to. We all have a lot of content we take in. And I am not so entitled to believe that I deserve all of your time. Your time is valuable. So normally I want to do that. I could probably talk about this for hours. I won't. And if I end up having a lot of thoughts on it and it is simply too long for one episode, I, may split it up. So, to be determined on that. So the first thing that I want to do is give some general impressions of the overall interview. Most of us who aren't living under a rock have seen a lot of, to quote Rachel's word, vitriol, which is a great word and it's very descriptive, but, I just noticed she said it a lot. So we'll go with that. There's been so much vitriol online about, people being angry and upset with Bethenny and people being upset with Rachel. So what people appreciate about me, at least the feedback that I've received, which thank you to everyone who has just been so kind and so supportive. I'm just overwhelmed with gratitude and I appreciate all of you. So thank you very much. But what I want to do is kind of give a unbiased, two sides of the coin view to everything, to what Bethenny said, to what Rachel said. I'm a human and I have my own opinions, but as a therapist and as a clinician, I just want to point out, some really important pieces. What is so fascinating about all of this? 100 people can watch the same episode of a show and have 100 different opinions. So our perspective is our reality, point blank. Whatever happens up here, between our ears is our reality. And I think that for me, it was important to hear and listen for myself to each and every segment of the interviews, because so many Bravo accounts have covered this and they're really doing such amazing work. Shout out to all you amazing, hardworking Bravo accounts. There have been so many people who have recapped what was said. For me as a therapist, most of the important stuff is in not what's said, but how it's said, but in the body language, in the, physicality of how people react when they're talking about things. Those things tell me more than actually what was said. I wanted to hear, Bethenny's tone of voice, Rachel's tone of voice. I wanted to hear all that. And I didn't want to just take, snippets of kind of what people have said. So I really did the research, unlike Bethenny. I really listened. I wish there was a way we could have watched it. And if there is, maybe I'm wrong, please let me know. But for me as a therapist, I do a lot of interpretation of body language and things like that. And that does help me form an opinion. So I definitely did not experience that. But the things when we experience and hear interviews like this, our perspective is shaped by our traumas or our experiences of things that have happened. So, and that's going back to perspective is reality. So I'm not saying I'm the authority on this. I'm just going to give you my opinions and clinical feedback based on my perspective. So the first thing I'll start with, I'm going to do some overarching things that I noticed. The first thing that I noticed is that Bethenny was so ill prepared for this interview that as a professional person, it just irritated me. I'm going to be honest. I think that, people compared her to Howie Mandel. And to be honest, I think that's more than fair. I don't understand how you could sit in front of a microphone and share perspectives and thoughts and analysis and assessment of something that you are not even aware of. To be honest, I feel that's irresponsible. And it just goes to show that, just having a microphone in front of you doesn't always mean the content that you're going to get is balanced. So, as a consumer, I encourage you all to be really thoughtful in how you consume shows because, to me, Bethenny and Howie did a grave disservice to both the people that they interviewed and the general public. Bethenny didn't watch the show. She said she didn't watch the show. She watched the reunions, which is better than nothing. But she hasn't watched Vanderpump Rules at all. And she was doing something that I found very odd, which is she was researching as she was interviewing Rachel, like actively on the podcast, which again, to me, and listen, in fairness, I'm going to tell you right now, I'm type A. Okay. So I'm a little bit perfectionistic. I definitely take a lot of pride in my work. And for me, what comes out of your mouth is really important. And I'm very thoughtful about it. I think what irritates people about Bethenny is she can be very reckless with her words. She speaks in a lot of, I can't think of the word I'm looking for. She speaks in extremes and then ends up being very contradictory. And so I find when people speak impulsively without coming from a place of understanding, you do get this wild back and forth swinging perspectives and opinions. So part of what I do with this podcast is I do everything to avoid that. I try to be very thoughtful and approach things and do research. It was just sloppy to me. It was sloppy, and it came across in the interview as if, you know, Bethenny just wanted to get this out. She was clearly eager and anxious to have the public hear this, which, you know, I get it. As a podcaster, I do understand that. But for me, I'm never going to put something out before I'm ready and before I've researched it. That's just me. The one of the other things that I noticed is that there were so many ads. Okay. So people are talking about, you know, Bethenny exploiting Rachel, just like everybody else is exploiting her. And to be honest, I reserved judgment until I listened to the podcast. And what became so apparent to me is it was more ad than it was podcast. So what does that tell me? Okay, that tells me a couple things. That tells me that Bethenny made a lot of money on ads. She also gets paid per download. So the sloppiness of just getting it out and then all the ads and all of that kind of tells me that there was a self-serving purpose to it for sure, which again, no shade. I mean, you know, some could say this is self-serving, right? I'm looking at their interview and I'm sharing my thoughts on it. But I'm doing it free. It's ad-free. And well, at least on YouTube. It may not be on Acast, and I don't have total awareness of that yet, but you know, there are differences. But I do think it's important to acknowledge that, you know, all of us to an extent, you know, we're taking this information and we're, you know, putting our spin on it and we're putting it out there. So I think we have to be careful throwing stones at each other. But clearly Bethenny made some money on this interview and Rachel did not. So the one thing at the end that I did hear from Bethenny is that she flew to Arizona, where Rachel is now residing, and at least temporarily. So Bethenny flew down there, and she initially said, and forgive me for those of you watching video, I'm going to be kind of looking at notes. It's just so much, I can't keep it all in my brain. But Bethenny flew out to Arizona. And at first, Bethenny said, I did it so that you would, you know, feel safe and comfortable, which I thought, well, that's okay. That's sweet. That's kind. That's considerate. People were saying, well, you know, she probably made Rachel pay for airfare, blah, blah, blah. So Rachel did not have to pay for any airfare. Bethenny came to her. But then Bethenny said that she was afraid that Rachel was going to get cold feet. And so it took that kind of like, oh, that was sweet. And it quickly, for me, told me that this is still very self-serving for Bethenny. It's great for her to say that she did it for Rachel to be safe and comfortable. And listen, maybe part of her did. But then she immediately gave herself away. She told on herself when she said that she was afraid she would get cold feet. So, you know, that kind of was interesting there. I want to address the overarching topic of, you know, Bethenny doing this. Like, what are her reasons for doing this? You know, people are saying that, you know, she's taking advantage of Rachel and all these things. And I want to say that altruism or helping others is something that people often get, you know, there's a term, it's called helper's high, quote unquote, helper's high, which just means that people who help people, myself included, there are secondary gains always when we help somebody. And even the secondary gain might just be, it makes us feel good. It makes us feel happy to be helpful to people. And I certainly, you know, have experienced that. I love helping people. I've dedicated my life to it. But what is frustrating to me is that Bethenny is unable to claim altruism when she is ironically part of the same machine that she's trying to dismantle. I'm just going to say that. Now, Bethenny is trying to give Rachel the opportunity to share her voice and all these things, but there are obviously secondary gains that Bethenny is getting here. And I think that we can't ignore that. And I do think that there's an irony in, Bethenny is trying to take down the machine of, the Bravoverse and reality TV and all these things, but she is also a part of that in doing all of this with Rachel, which again, fine. But I think that if Bethenny had just acknowledged that, people would be less frustrated with her. She's just giving a lot of very black and white behavior, a lot of extremes. When she was all in with Bravo, she was all in with Bravo. There were tweets that came out that she, Aviva Drescher, someone had said that Bravo forced them to drink, and she tweeted saying, like, that is not true. This has never been true, and blah, blah, blah. And now she's saying the opposite years later. So it just comes off as very disingenuous. And I think that's what leads people to feel frustrated, which I understand that. The last thing I'm going to say overall before I get into the nitty gritty of it all is that I think two things: that Bethenny did appear to be empathetic, kind, and caring towards Rachel. Okay, so as a human being, I just appreciate the humanness that Bethenny showed Rachel, because whatever you all think about Rachel, she is a person who did some bad stuff, made some really bad choices. What she did was terrible, but she's a human. And I think that can't get lost in the sauce. I think that from hearing the interview as a trained clinician, I can tell that she received real treatment. Not just like, people go to treatment facilities all the time, and either the treatment facility isn't great, or you could go to the greatest treatment facility in the world, but if you're not ready to change and utilize the tools you learn, it's not going to do anything. I can tell Rachel did go to a real good treatment center and that she did gain insight and awareness. I can tell that. But I can also understand why people feel frustrated, because Rachel seemed to take accountability, but then kind of make excuses and backstep and backpedal on certain things. So I think that's why people are frustrated. So I'm going to go over some specific things and then talk a little bit about where I feel there were wins and where I feel there weren't, and maybe some room for improvement. So what I'm going to do is pull up my notes. So we'll do part one first. I'll go over that part first, because in part one, Rachel talks a lot about treatment and, where she went, what she learned, why did she go. So I'm just going to read you some notes that I have, some thoughts on that. So Rachel confirmed she did go to a treatment facility in Arizona called the Meadows for 90 days, which I will say, something in my brain just kind of made a mental note. She kept mentioning the Meadows. And so I'm hoping that she's just doing that not out of a sense of obligation or like an advertising deal or something. She's just sharing where she went. But that did stick in my mind a little bit. So she says she went to examine her choices to figure out why she continues to find herself in unhealthy relationships, and she wanted to identify what she needs to change. She reports wanting to know the why behind her behaviors, which, bravo, great. I think that the human race would be far better off if we all try to focus on ourselves and figure out, okay, well, if I did something crappy, why did I do what I did? Let me figure this out so that I can do better next time. And so initially when she said that, I thought, well, that's great. And I give her a lot of credit for that. The one thing she said she learned a lot about in treatment was toxic shame versus healthy shame, which I think is something really interesting. I haven't heard a lot of other accounts talk about, but I did want to address it. So what that means is the treatment facility wants, and her therapist wants her to take accountability for her behaviors. But what they don't want her to do is take more accountability than is hers to take. And toxic shame can be just really awful and impossible to live with. But healthy shame kind of means, okay, I acknowledge I did A, B, and C. These are the consequences of my behavior. Here's what I'm going to do to change that. But sometimes we do need to feel bad about the things that we've done. But we have to do it in a way that's not punishing or, self-harmy or anything like that. So for me, that's a little bit of what that means. She talked about while she was in treatment feeling, she had an offer to go to treatment before the reunion, but she went to the reunion because she felt like she needed to fulfill her work obligation, which again, I think is amazing. I mean, LVP didn't show up to the reunion for a lot less. So I will give her credit for, she went and she took the beating and she knew what she was going to get and she did it anyway. So kudos to her about that. She learned in treatment that she shared her authentic story and she was met with grace and compassion from her peers, and she's learning to forgive herself and be compassionate, which again, great. She can't, as mad as anybody listening to this might be, she cannot continue to flog herself for public approval. I mean, she's a human person and she needs to work on it and move forward. You can't get stuck in it. So I also give her a lot of credit for that. The why behind her behaviors that I found really interesting is I had another clairvoyant moment where I posted about this before. I theorized that she either was going to say or she really did experience a sex and love addiction. And she did say in the interview that it took a while for her to accept, but she acknowledged having a quote unquote love addiction and talked a little bit about her codependency and, kind of being addicted to love and, leading her to make bad choices with Sandoval. My goal is to do another entire podcast on the topic of sex and love addiction because it's a really complex topic, and it does go hand in hand with, addiction and codependency and, mental health issues and all these things. So I think it's a great topic. If you're interested in hearing about, I can definitely do an episode about that. I have a really good friend who has her PhD in psychology with a focus on sexual health and development. And, I'm hoping that maybe she'd be willing to come on the podcast and give her thoughts about that as well. She talked about her name change. She addressed that. And it was kind of what was in the media, which is essentially she was born Rachel. But when she was in third or fourth grade, she was young and there were a bunch of other Rachels and she wanted to feel special and unique. So she chose the name Raquel. And she admits she wasn't comfortable in her own skin. She claims she wanted to be someone better, which is so sad. Imagine being in like third grade and feeling like, well, I'm not special and I need to be better. I mean, that definitely tells me that she has been open about her family history of being adopted and the kind of interesting circumstances around that. Her birth mother is her biological. So her birth mother gave Rachel up for adoption to her sister. So Rachel's mother is really biologically her aunt. and her aunt and uncle raised her as her parents. She calls them mom and dad, and they are. I'm not diminishing that in any way, shape, or form. I'm just trying to explain the family tree, because just a friendly reminder that family does not always mean blood. In fact, sometimes it really doesn't. And, people who are adopted and fostered and things like that are, family is family. So just a really quick comment on that. But in treatment, what I theorized in a post was that if she really did seek treatment, reintegrating the name would be part of her treatment. And I was correct. It is. So I'm going to explain. Reintegration is kind of a technique that therapists use or treatment facilities use when people are disconnected or disassociated from themselves, for a plethora of reasons that can happen: mental health issues, substance abuse, trauma, a variety of things. So the treatment facility helped reintegrate that kind of dual part of her. And I do believe that that's a powerful process. And I think it's wonderful for her to take her name back and really own it. I will call her what she wants to be called, because I believe that we should call people what they want to be called. Point blank, period. Whatever they say they want to be called, that's that up to them, and I'm going to be respectful. The first episode where it kind of lost me is Rachel started to talk about how the show is contrived and it's not factual. Producers claim pay was based on a good season and that she took direction well. For me, this statement took away some of the good accountability that she took earlier. Because to me, what this says is that I was a good reality TV personality. This wasn't totally my fault. I was doing what they asked me to do. And that I don't like, because we are accountable. The only person who's accountable for our behavior is us. When people hurt you or they do things to you or you hurt somebody else, whatever it is, we need to take ownership for our stuff. I think just in society, there's like a huge lack of that in general. And I feel that Bethenny kind of pounced on this because it fits Bethenny's narrative, right? That reality TV is toxic. It's a disaster. And, this whole reality reckoning thing, this suits her narrative. So for me, they both took a misstep there, in my opinion. You're welcome to disagree, and I would love to hear your thoughts on that. One of the other things that frustrated me about what Rachel and Bethenny talked about is that they talked kind of about Ariana, and it's like, can we not do that? In terms, it's like Rachel claims that the relationship between Tom and Ariana, she said that if the relationship were stronger, she wouldn't have engaged in that behavior. Excuse me? What? That is insane. That is so insane. You can't make an excuse for your behavior because their relationship wasn't strong. That's not acceptable. And then, Bethenny implied that, well, because they weren't an authentic relationship and because they didn't have children and weren't married, she didn't understand why it was such a big deal. That part enraged me. I'm going to be very honest. Let me be real clear. PSA right now. You do not need to be married or have children to be a legitimate family. Okay? Can we just let that sink in for a minute? That is so bonkers to me because, Emily, I'm sorry. Bethenny is engaged to Paul, right? She has a daughter with Jason, but her and Paul don't have children. So essentially, by her logic, if Paul had an affair with one of Bethenny's best friends, it shouldn't be a big deal because they're not married and they don't have kids. Boom. Turned it around. That just shows how crazy that is. Rachel claimed that she was hanging out with Tom more than Ariana, and she never spent time with Ariana off the show. So I'm not even going to go into the details of this because the details irritate me. But what I'm going to call out about this is semantics. I don't like dealing with semantics because it's a way when people use these little semantics to try to like skirt responsibility, it's a way to just like usurp their personal accountability. And I don't believe in that. I think that you can't take accountability, but then say, well, Ariana and I weren't really best friends. Please, you were friends. And even if you weren't, even if her and Ariana were never really friends, it was wrong. You knew it was wrong. It was wrong. And it wasn't good for anybody. So just say that. Don't start trying to talk about Ariana and what she did or she didn't do. I don't like that. Because then that gets into, it just gets into a territory that, we don't need to get into. The one major thing that I want to talk about right now is the infamous video. Because as a therapist, as a woman, as a feminist, as a human, the rage I feel about this situation with the video makes me, I can't even tell you how angry it makes me. So here's what Rachel said about the infamous video. It was recorded on March 1st, 2023. Rachel was in New York City for Watch What Happens Live. And this incident occurred the evening before she was going on Watch What Happens Live. She stated, "I was in a nice hotel in New York City and decided to be adventurous." She stated that during the act of, to be discreet, I'll say self-pleasure, she stated that she FaceTimed Tom because I guess her and Tom FaceTime a lot. And in that FaceTime, Tom recorded her without her consent. Okay, so we've known that. We've already known that. But, Rachel talked about it and she said, "I expected to have my privacy. He recorded me without my consent. If he asked me, I would have said no." So we've known that. That's totally, absolutely insane, abusive, predatory. No, that's not acceptable. But what she said that really frustrated me is, and also to be clear, I'm taking, what her and Bethenny said, it's what they said. It doesn't mean it's true. But Rachel claims that when she confronted Tom about him recording the video, that she did it on camera. She confronted him on camera, and he claims that he wanted her to see how beautiful she was. Barf. Oh my God. I can't even with Tom Sandoval. So Rachel claims she confronted him on camera, but this next part for me is absolutely problematic if this is true. She claims that Tom threw a temper tantrum with production and he refused to film until that part was taken out. So the way that she said it was, he boycotted filming the rest of Scandival so he could have editing rights to the scene. And Bethenny claims she's seen that before. If this is true, if that happened and someone decided to take it out, perhaps there are legal reasons for that. I would imagine, and I can't speak to that. That's not my forte. I do have some Bish lawyers who have reached out, and I do plan to have some or a bunch of them on the show to speak to some of these things. But if that really happened, I feel that Bravo, it's so much darker than any of us realize. That is disgusting. If someone knew that this was happening and then decided to take it out so that Tom Sandoval wouldn't be embarrassed about behavior that, quite frankly, should put him on a list somewhere. No, that's not okay. Now, Bravo has since come forth and challenged claims made in this interview about, I'm trying to look for it in my notes. Rachel said that Tom had a production credit, or was offered a production credit for this upcoming season of Vanderpump Rules. And Bravo has since released a statement saying that that is not true. It doesn't mean that Bravo's telling the truth. Doesn't mean that Rachel's telling the truth. Doesn't mean that anyone's telling the truth. But again, if that were the case, to me, that would be incredibly problematic for Bravo. It just incredibly. So I think one of the things that I'm going to do now is I'm going to decide to make this a 2-part podcast. I know that people might not be super thrilled hearing that, but I'm looking at the recording and we're already almost 40 minutes in, and I truly have so much more to say. So for today, I'm going to leave this part here. Looking through my notes really quickly, what I'm going to leave you with is from part 1, my overall impressions, and kind of a teaser for part 2. This won't be 3 parts. Part 2 will cover the rest of my thoughts. So the first thing that struck me from part 1 of the interview is that, as I mentioned before, Bethenny never watched it. She watched clips and developed her opinions from there, which is just sloppy and messy and just, not good practice. Bethenny claims that the show was based on alcohol and affairs. The couple wasn't married, had no kids, so she didn't understand the anger. I've addressed that. Bethenny, the last thing that I commented about online that people really were interested in is that I feel like a lot of this with Bethenny is she's projecting her stuff onto Rachel. So Bethenny stated, "You could be my daughter. I would be in jail for murder if I were your mom." And there was a point where Bethenny actually started crying. She was overwhelmed with emotion, but I don't think that was necessarily for Rachel. I think it was for Bethenny. She's raising a daughter who's, a teenager now. And obviously we know about the contentious stuff with, Bryn's dad. And I think that Bethenny sees, she loves her daughter and she's very protective. And I think she's projecting her stuff onto Rachel. And, that's abundantly obvious based on her emotionality around it. Because, while crying when someone's sharing with you is an empathetic response, that's happened to me a bunch in therapy. If I'm really moved by something, that the pain that I'm hearing and what clients talk about, sure, there's tears that come up. I'm a human. But with Bethenny, it kind of feels more, there's something behind it for her. So again, that's no shade to her. What happens, we project our stuff onto people all the time, and people project their stuff onto us. There's, all of that happens. But I just wanted to give a little bit of education around that.
That concludes part 1. Now stay tuned for part 2.
So where we left off last time was we had covered episode 1. I gave my overarching thoughts about the whole thing, some good things that Bethenny and Rachel did, some missteps, shared with you a little bit of definition about, the treatment facility and things that she would have accomplished in treatment based on what she said. So just to give you a little overview there. Today, the topics that I'm going to cover are very important topics of HIPAA and Americans with Disabilities Act, mental health advocacy, and the like. The reason that I feel the need to talk about that is Rachel and Bethenny had made some claims interesting claims about HIPAA and Andy and breaking HIPAA and things like that. And so it was clear to me that Rachel and Bethenny didn't have a good idea of what HIPAA is, which, fair enough. Professionals need to be aware of it because it's part of our clinical practice. You have to have awareness and concerns about private health information, PHI, private and protected health information. Part of therapy is obviously confidentiality and keeping things private. So, therapists have to become really well acquainted with these topics. And since they were kind of talked about in the interview in ways that was confusing, I am here to clear that up for you. So let's get right into it. Before I talk about the HIPAA and the mental health advocacy of it all, I want to start out by saying, one of the things that struck me in episode 2 was Rachel talked about her experience and just not feeling safe. Her and her family were receiving death threats and things like that. And so I just want to give a little PSA here as a human. Can we not? You can be mad at somebody without hurting them or throwing something at them or threatening to harm them or kill them. That is so wild to me. If someone's behavior makes you so angry that you are threatening to harm them or someone they love, I think that's really something that needs to be looked at. It is possible to be angry and to dislike Rachel, to find what she did reprehensible, but to do things like that to her and her family, it's just not acceptable at all. The second thing that I wanted to comment on is that, she talked about not feeling safe. I've seen some things online kind of mocking her. And, as a therapist who, for me, if you've listened to me, you know that what I'm about is human rights. And especially with marginalized communities, for me, that is just one of the absolute most important parts of my job, is to advocate for people who are unable to advocate for themselves. So when Rachel says that she doesn't feel safe, period, end of sentence, we don't get to have a different opinion about that because that's her experience. And who are we to tell her that she shouldn't feel that way? She doubled down on the Sheena punch of it all, or as Rachel said, which was kind of a funny way to say it, that Sheena socked her in the eye, pushed her and threw her phone. Listen, being cheated on, for those of us who have experienced it, in the past, obviously not, my husband is amazing. We have a beautiful relationship. But if you've ever been in a relationship where you've been cheated on, you're hurt, and if we had a national platform like Ariana did, do I think Ariana and the group went too far with it? Sure, I do. But do I also understand why they did? Yeah. I mean, imagine your worst breakup if you had the entire world behind you. If you don't think that would get to your head a little bit, I think we're wrong about that. I understand why it got to Ariana's head a little bit, but and Sheena and to the rest of the group. But to reiterate, putting your hands on someone is just never okay. It's just not acceptable. And so I don't know. I think we're close to the truth of what happened. Sheena shared her truth. She talked about how she can't make a fist because of her nails, blah, blah, blah. I get it. I think that these people have done things and said things to Rachel that now, in the hindsight of sanity and calmness, that they probably regret. So, just I want everyone to know that Rachel is a human who's deserving of happiness. I think most humans are deserving of happiness, unless, people are super evil and awful people. I don't mean those people, but, Rachel's a human being. So let's just leave that where it is. It was interesting because Bethenny didn't ask a lot of follow-up questions or critical questions, meaning, as an interviewer and as a therapist, right, part of my clinical practice is assessment, and I'm a really good assessor. And what assessing is just asking a lot of questions, and it's asking questions from different angles so that you might get more from people than, if you ask a question that's a yes or no, a closed question versus an open question, which is tell me about, or, can you share with me? So I just didn't love Bethenny's interview style. It seemed very self-serving, in my opinion. But Bethenny, the one thing she did challenge Rachel on, which was, people will say you signed up for this. And Rachel's response was, I thought reality TV would be fun. Okay, fine. But anyone with any sort of awareness about what reality TV is knows that it's certainly not fun. It's a job. It's toxic, even in the best of situations. It's not, it's not fun. You hear a lot of housewives and people on Bravo and in reality talk about how it had, being on TV negatively impacted their mental, physical, spiritual health, what have you. So for me, when Rachel says, well, I thought it would be fun, your lack of awareness doesn't preclude you from, it doesn't preclude you from taking accountability and ownership of the decision that you made, right? So, she blames Bravo and producers and things, but at the same time, what I know, as a therapist, but also, I have my own therapist, I have a lot of health issues. We have to be our own best advocate. Nobody's going to do it for us. Nobody. Not your boss, not your family, not, your doctors, your whatever. You have to be your own best advocate. So I think that that's something that maybe comes with a little bit of wisdom and experience and age. I am a lot older than Rachel, but I think that that's for me a really important piece of this to share is, we make decisions and then we experience consequences for those decisions, and then we have to adjust accordingly. And we are the only people responsible for that. Bethenny did a lot of talking about how Rachel was treated in general. And there was this segment where she read off all the awful things that, people said to her at their reunion. And, Bethenny cries. And for me, this appeared very inauthentic. It appeared to me like Bethenny was trying to manufacture kind of like a Dr. Phil moment, but in my opinion, she lacked the emotional depth and ability to really get there. I think that Bethenny's tears, I said this in the last episode, I think her tears were more about her own projection. But I do think that Bethenny, has empathy for Rachel, and she certainly treated her kindly. So, I will certainly give her credit for that. But that moment for me specifically felt a little bit inauthentic. Bethenny, of course, took the opportunity to pat herself on the back, which, fine. Being your own best advocate sometimes means giving yourself props. Again, no shade in that, but it seems like Bethenny, the way she does it is very self-focused. And, she talked about the Bethenny clause, which for people who didn't listen or don't know what that means is that Bethenny started Skinny Girl on Bravo, and Bravo ended up putting in a clause that if you are promoting a business on Housewives or on Bravo, you have to kick up a percentage from your personal business to Bravo. I assume she knows what she's talking about there. I know nothing about that. but she credits herself with enacting that change to the Bravo universe, which again, it just felt a little bit self-serving, but that's fine. The part that irritated me is when, Bethenny and Rachel were talking about how successful everyone has been in the Vanderpump Rules universe adjacent to this. And they're right about that, right? Lala was able to buy a house in Palm Springs from the Send It to Daryl sweatshirts, and they have all, the sandwich shop and just Tom's band and all these other things. They all benefited in some way. And of course, so did Bravo. I mean, Bethenny, the one thing that she did during this part of the interview is she discussed and shared the ratings for the part 3 of the Vanderpump reunion. And it was staggering. It definitely did give you a sense of, wow, there are some people in upper management who made a killing off of the backs of these people. So in that aspect, the reality reckoning is very real. What I think people get lost in is that I think the reality reckoning is real and human rights are being trampled. And I think it's a good thing that needs to change. But two things can be true. That can be true. And Bethenny can also be kind of self-serving and frustrating and contradictory. So I don't want the whole reality reckoning to get lost in the sauce, because I do think things need to change. But going back to what irritated me about what they said is that, they both had kind of lamented that, well, Rachel was the only one to not profit, to rack up debt because she went to treatment, and now her reputation is tarnished. And my response to that is a you problem. Okay. Now, did Bravo, exploit? Well, sure, but that's Bravo's whole format, to be clear. I mean, exploiting women and not paying them super well and using their images in perpetuity forever. I mean, that's the reason for this whole thing. So that's not the same as Rachel saying, well, now I'm in debt from this treatment and I'm not making any money. Well, you created that, right? I mean, side note, and I did say this in one of my other podcasts, treatment, mental, physical, or otherwise, should not cost an arm and a leg. You shouldn't have to be in debt and sell a house or go into medical debt to get yourself good treatment. That is some serious bullshit. The medical system is broken. I'm going to be honest about that. However, Rachel chose to carry out an affair on TV, on a show that she knew, it would come to light, it would come to fruition. Those were her choices. So taking accountability, for me, I can tell when that Rachel there's some growth there, but there needs to be more. Because lamenting about how you're not profiting off of this is just, as PK would say, it's not a good look, babe. It's just not. So, I think that if she, wants to start a podcast and, profit off of sharing her experience, strength, and hope with others, which is, in the program of AA and in a lot of treatment facilities, they follow a 12-step a guideline. And with sex and love addiction, there is a 12-step program called Sex and Love Addiction Anonymous, or Sex and Love Addicts Anonymous. So from the language that she was using, it told me as a therapist that she probably really was encouraged by people in the treatment center to share her experience, strength, and hope with others. So if that's what she wants to use her podcast for, great. But and of course, do we all want to make a living and do we want to make money? Yes. But I just think, there's some contradictory bits in that piece of it for me. Let's see. Oh, one thing they discussed was the spinoff and the hypocrisy of it. And I fully agree with it. So for those of you who don't know, Stassi, Jax, Brittany, and Kristen Doty were fired the season before Scandival for some things that they did. And to be honest, I'm not exactly sure. I think it was racially motivated, kind of racist statements or things like that. I'm not totally sure. So I'm not going to act as if I know for sure. But they did something negative regarding race. And then they made comments about, after the scandal of it all, they are all given this redemption arc to come back in the spinoff. And what Rachel and Bethenny were saying is accurate in terms of, it is kind of hypocritical. They were just fired for behavior that the network deemed made them unemployable. And now they're walking back on it and employing them seemingly for the bottom dollar, right? So I do think they had a point there. Here's where I'm going to use the word alleged a lot, and I'm going to talk about what Rachel said about James because I don't want to get myself in hot water. But Rachel believes the spinoff is a way to silence Kristen about her allegations that she made against James. Okay, so Kristen Doty made allegations that James was emotionally, verbally, and physically abusive to her. And that there was one event, allegedly, that was caught on camera, but wasn't included in the show, according to Kristen. Bethenny and Rachel discuss a cover-up involving Bravo trying to bury the lead to make money to keep the show going. Now, what's interesting is I was on Instagram yesterday and Kristen Doty shared a message. She came forward and she said, some of what Rachel said was accurate about her and James. Now, she didn't say specifically what was accurate and what wasn't, but Rachel reported seeing James be, quote unquote, a violent person, and she believes Kristen Doty. Here's what I'm going to say about that, because I do have to be careful. The observable behavior that James displayed on the show from season 1 to last season has been atrocious. I don't understand why people adore him. The arguments that he has gotten on with people in the show have certainly, from my clinical observation, have been verbally abusive, hands down, without a doubt. I can't speak to the physicality. I can't speak to that, but I can tell you what I've seen is abusive behavior from him. And that's what he was willing to show on TV. So for me, when people are willing to show really, really strong behavior that's really inappropriate, if they're willing to show that on TV, my clinical question is what's happening behind the scenes, right? If this is what you're willing to show, then wow, that's quite a threshold. So I thought that was all very interesting. But again, I think Bethenny and Rachel are trying to use these points to make their case stronger. And the two are apples and oranges. That's just my thought on that. So the last part of part 2 that I want to talk about before I move on to HIPAA and all of that is Bethenny talked about her therapist, Dr. Matt Pulowitz. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly. I do follow him on Instagram. He doesn't really have a huge page. He's not very big on Instagram. But again, I wanted to do my actual research and I looked him up. So he has his PsyD, which is a doctorate of psychology. It's different from a PhD, but you can, write prescriptions and, make diagnoses and do all the things essentially that psychiatrists do. I think the only difference is, if I'm wrong, please correct me, but I don't know if people with PsyD have admitting privileges in hospitals like someone with a PhD does. I'm not exactly sure, but I'm going to do my homework and then I'll get back to you on that. So Bethenny asked her therapist to watch the reunion and give his thoughts. So I found that interesting because I was thinking to myself, if I had a notable client and they asked me to, watch something, that's not out of the realm of inappropriate. If something's important to a client and they want you to see it, they want you to watch it, listen to it. Absolutely. I've done that a million times. What is interesting to me is that he gave her feedback, and I don't know if he gave her permission to air it or if she just did. I don't know how comfortable I would feel with that because, at the end of my podcast, I do a disclaimer, to keep from getting sued because essentially I am able to clinically, diagnose, but it's inappropriate to do it through armchair psychology. If you have a client in front of you, that's a different story. Watching people on TV and watching a snippet is far different from observing somebody in person and truly accurately assessing them. So I don't know if he can get in a bit of trouble for that. I'm not sure. But apparently what he said was that he talked about the difference between punishment and abuse. And he's right about that. So again, we can all dislike Rachel and be really angry with her, but the behavior that was showed to her at the reunion was so abusive. I mean, the name calling, the rage, and, just the pure seething anger. Again, I get it. I understand why Ariana and the rest of the crew were angry. Understandable. But again, you can be angry without verbally eviscerating somebody. And I think that, everyone just wanted to step up to the plate and just boom, 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 just verbally eviscerate her. And she sat there and she took it. I'll give her credit for that. But from a therapist perspective, of course, that's not appropriate. From a fan perspective, fans loved to see it. Fans were like, yeah, like burn her at the stake. So for me as a fan and a therapist, I fall somewhere in the middle. Was it entertaining? I mean, for me, I don't get super entertained by really mean, angry, aggressive stuff. That's not what rocks my socks. But I understand why for some people it was entertaining. Bethenny, here's what frustrated me. She started to reference studies about emotional abuse and started to give a definition, but she clearly Googled it and was just reading from Google the definition of emotional abuse. And again, as a clinician, I don't like that because psychology is not just something that any person can just speak on. There's theories and tenets and, there's an art to it as well. So I think that Bethenny kind of overreached in her competency. We all have limitations with competency. There are people who, have really, when you start off in the field and they have a really significant background and, don't have experience and you're not trained for that. I think as a therapist and just as a human, it's good to know your limitations. We all have them. And that's just part of being human. There are some areas that I won't treat because I don't, I don't feel incredibly competent to do so. For example, people with psychotic disorders, schizophrenia, things like that, I can be honest, that's not my wheelhouse. So I think that Bethenny was trying to be like an armchair psychologist, and I just didn't like it, personally. But the one thing that the therapist noted, which was true, is that, what he asked Bethenny, he's like, I was confused about what the goal was of this reunion. It seemed like there was no conflict resolution as a goal. And I was like, well, of course not, because reality TV and actual real life being a person are two totally different things. So yeah, there was no goal of conflict resolution there. It was, let's eviscerate this person for ratings, let's all make some money, and then Vanderpump Rules is saved. So, I have a lot of feelings about that, but I just don't, I would love to hear from him. I would love to hear from Dr. Polowitz, if I'm saying that right. If he ever contacted me, I'd be happy to have him on my podcast. But to be determined about that. Now, let me get to part 3 before I talk too much and make this too long also. I'm going to explain what HIPAA is. And, Rachel talked about wanting a mental health advocate that wasn't given to her. So I'm going to really clearly lay out what are these concepts, how would that have impacted her, and, just kind of like everything having to do with that. So HIPAA stands for the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, which was enacted in 1996. It was President Clinton at the time signed the bill into law, and essentially it is a federal law that required the creation of national standards to protect sensitive patient health information from being disclosed without the patient's consent or knowledge. HIPAA treats mental health information the same as any other health information. So there's not separate HIPAA for mental health versus, physical health. The laws and regulations around it can sometimes vary from state to state. So despite this being a law for national standards, the caveat is each state has its own requirements regarding how patient medical information should be kept private and secure. And some states do it better than others. I live in the state of Pennsylvania, and so what we're talking about is the state of California. I can't speak to those laws because I'm not completely familiar with them. But California, what I do know is that the governor has really had a great focus on mental health. And if you just do a quick Google search, if you Google HIPAA California, it will tell you all of the mental health initiatives that California is trying to enact or trying to uphold. And it's beautiful. It's wonderful. Again, the LGBTQIA plus community, other people with mental health issues, substance abuse issues, people of color, any sort of marginalized communities, I am here to advocate for all of them. So HIPAA, to be clear, is something that only professionals can break. So I'm going to explain this and then follow up. So it generally prohibits healthcare providers and healthcare businesses called covered entities from disclosing protected information to anyone other than a patient or the patient's authorized representatives without their consent. It doesn't restrict patients from receiving information about themselves. Typically, there's always caveats, but if patients voluntarily share their health information, they don't get confidentiality if they have voluntarily shared it. So if, for example, Rachel talked about when she went into treatment, one of her peers was in treatment and recognized her. And Rachel proceeded to fill her in on everything, tell her everything that had been happening on the outside about Scandival and what was going on with her. And then the person that she told left treatment and then spilled the beans. Well, that happens all the time, unfortunately, in treatment. I used to work in an inpatient residential treatment facility for alcohol and substance abuse. And that happens all the time. People see people in treatment facilities other patients, other clients, and they go and they tell people, so our best advice is always to people listening to this. If you are going to treatment or thinking about it, well, A, do it. It's the best thing you'll ever do. But B, you have to be mindful of who you tell what to, especially if you're a notable person. The therapist, the facility, if they had made a comment about her being, at their treatment facility, that would have absolutely broken HIPAA, and they would have been held liable, and you can get fines, you can get shut down. It's, there's a lot of different rules and regulations regarding that. And it varies state by state. But that was on Rachel, when sharing very deeply personal, and listen, I get it. She was probably like so relieved to see a friendly face who wasn't just screaming at her and telling her to screw off. I understand why she did it, but that's not a HIPAA violation. Now to address what Rachel said about Andy. Andy commented on feeling that Rachel was medicated at the reunion, and Rachel took umbrage to that, which, to be honest, I did as well, because for me, it's a fine line. Yes, I talk about mental health issues and things like that, but I try to do it from a perspective of learning and growing and educating. And Andy, I think he just kind of flippantly made the comment. Other people's treatment plan is none of our business. Now, Rachel's sharing her treatment plan, so I'm going to share what she shared. But for me, talking about someone's medication or treatment plan, especially as technically her boss, I felt was, he probably just got caught up in the moment of all of it and said it, and I'm sure he regrets saying it. Maybe he doesn't, I don't know. But Andy cannot break HIPAA because he is not her healthcare practitioner. There is a caveat here that I'm going to talk about in a second, because Andy is technically her employer, which Bethenny pointed out. But here's the thing, Andy was giving his opinion. Okay. So as a therapist doing this podcast, being a therapist and having this platform doesn't preclude me from having an opinion. Okay. So I'm a human being who has opinions, but, so I think Andy, it was the same situation. He's her boss. He's, a Bravo executive, but he was sharing an opinion. And while I didn't love it, he certainly wasn't violating any sort of HIPAA. But here's where it gets a little wonky, and I'm going to explain why. Rachel stated that a mental health advocate was promised to her to be with her in the trailer the day of the taping. Now, a mental health advocate, let me be clear what that is that can be anybody. It can be a therapist, but it also can be a family member. It can be a professional mental health advocate. But to be a mental health advocate, again, this varies state by state. You don't necessarily have to have educational requirements. It just requires you to be present and to advocate for the person at hand. Okay. So I think that I was surprised when I watched the Vanderpump Rules, all the reunion, that she didn't have someone there. I was kind of surprised by that. But what she's claiming is that she was supposed to have a mental health advocate there, and then the day before the taping, they took it away. She believes as a punishment for doing that interview outside the nail salon where people kind of teased her for looking like E.T., which I don't make fun of people's looks. That's really usually not how I roll. So I don't love that. But that is what she was claiming. Here's where this can get a little bit sticky. So a mental health advocate is a person who provides support to those with mental illness. Now, the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA for short, defines a disability as a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more life activities. When an employee has a mental health condition that meets that criteria, they have workplace rights under the ADA. So this is a gray area that could possibly, if what Rachel's saying is true, if Bravo did that and didn't cover themselves, they could be, in trouble for that because of, what I just said. So I'm going to explain that accommodations are a change in the work environment or in the way things are customarily done that enables an individual with a disability to enjoy equal employment opportunities. And that's really important. So employers must provide reasonable accommodations to applicants and workers with psychiatric disabilities and other disabilities unless this causes undue hardship. Ultimately, the employer decides which accommodation will be used, but employees should have a voice in this decision. So I'm just sharing that. I know it's a little bit confusing. You may have to rewind and listen to this, a million times. But also, I love that I just said rewind. Am I 100 years old? There's no rewinding anymore. But, I grew up in the 80s. Give me a break. So I do think that, unfortunately, people who fall under this category with the ADA and, needing accommodations, I've seen it happen over and over that people just, they don't get it. And I don't know if the loophole is that employers need to provide accommodations unless it causes hardship. So I guess if they can prove that they tried and there was no one available or it caused some sort of hardship, I guess they could skirt responsibility. But instead of getting into the details and semantics of it, I just want to say that, Vanderpump Rules probably would have been canceled, according to Alex Baskin, without this whole scandal. So if you're going to utilize somebody's story and it's going to create a situation for them that they need to end up getting treatment, ethically, I believe that Bravo for sure could have done way better. Period. Point blank. Legally, again, any of my Bish lawyers listening to this, please reach out. And, again, I'll try to get someone on the show to maybe revisit this from the legal perspective, because that's the part I'm not sure about. So I'm sure Bravo, they have enough lawyers and money to make sure, and double check that what they're doing is legal. So it may not have been illegal, but I'm going to say it was absolutely unethical. She should have had a mental health advocate there. There should have been no reason that it wasn't able to be done. And for me, this is something I'm going to examine more because I want to know. I want to know what really happened. Rachel also, to take this a step further, she asked for her treatment tuition, which is what it's called. When people go to treatment, it's like called tuition. She wanted her tuition to be covered and Bravo refused to pay for it. Bethenny says this is because they would be admitting liability. And, again, legally, I can't speak to that. That may be the case, but I think that what's interesting for me is that no one is helping Rachel with these costs. For me, if Bethenny keeps calling everyone out for failing to help her, how is she helping? That's my question. How are you helping? I think Bethenny feels like she's helping her just by giving her this platform, which to me, again, shows a little bit of entitlement because, well, fine, that got her story out there, but it also got her a lot of hate and a lot of vitriol. And, oh God, now I'm using that word like crazy. Because I keep hearing Rachel say it. So it's like Rachel getting paid for the interview has been a point of contention. There are people that say, she wasn't paid for the interview, but then Bethenny flew to see her, so there wasn't really a cost incurred there. Rachel claimed that she basically didn't make any money on the last season of Vanderpump Rules, but Lisa Vanderpump claims she made over $300,000. We may never know the true nitty gritty of it, but to me, again, I don't like getting lost in the details because it's a way to lose focus and to distract. The point is that Rachel incurred a lot of treatment based on what was aired, or I'm sorry, she incurred a lot of hate, which led to mental health issues, which led her to need to go to treatment. And, do I think that, there should be, Bethenny has a ton of money, and if she cares so much about this, then pay her tuition, like put your money where your mouth is. And maybe there's a reason why she can't or won't do that. I don't know. But I do think that if we're going to utilize these reality TV people and we're going to exploit them to an extent and make money off of them, well, they should be paid too. Right? Fair work, fair labor deserves fair payment. And, I certainly think, there's obviously a wage gap currently in this country, and there's no exceptions on Vanderpump Rules. Rachel talked about not getting paid as much as Tom and Ariana and things like that, and people say, well, she hasn't been there as long, but I mean, you could argue without her none of this would have happened. I mean, it's terrible to say that, but it's actually true. So it's just very confusing. I think that the last thing I'm going to say on this topic is that I said this in the last episode, but I just want to reiterate it. So in addition to, not getting, paid or whatever that story is and racking up debt, security was not offered to Rachel and her family initially. Bravo or someone has since offered her security now, but she says, well, now, we don't really need the protection. So I just think that as a human being, as an empathetic, caring soul, I do think Rachel got the short end of a lot in terms of how she was treated. So, you may respectfully disagree. I respect your opinions, but I think that, at the end of the day, we can't forget our humanity. And, at the end of the day, we all deserve, to be treated how we want to be treated. And the whole point in what I'm saying right now is like, death threats are not acceptable. Like, we can't get so angry with people that we just threaten their lives or, what have you. That is just totally unacceptable. So, that's kind of my thought on that. Two of the last things that I'm going to talk about, because we're already almost an hour in for this episode, thanks for hanging in there with me, is at the end, Bethenny said, is this dog thing relevant? And I was like, I wrote down, dude, are you serious? Is the dog thing relevant? I can't with Bethenny's lack of preparation. She knew nothing about the whole dog thing. And I'm like, oh, for the love. But Rachel, addressed it. I'm not going to, beat a dead horse because this has been everywhere. But Rachel claims the Graham had a history of aggression and biting, which was due to James encouraging the dog to bite his hand just because he liked how it felt or something. And when she went to treatment, she was going to rehome Graham, but I guess because Graham bit her mom and it was so severe that it was like down to the bone, they ended up having to research a rescue, which they did. And that apparently was supposed to be anonymous. And then when they saw the microchip, I guess they contacted Lisa Vanderpump, who adopted him. This whole, there's been so much hubbub about all this, but apparently Lisa adopted him, and then Rachel reported feeling that Graham was used as a chip to get her back, which I 1,000% believe to be true. I'm not the biggest LVP fan. I think she's very underhanded. And according to Rachel advocated for Graham and expressed concerns about James not being a fit dog parent. And LVP, she essentially said, use the dog as bait to bring her back. And Lisa allegedly discussed the potential scenes that they could get out of this. And I'm just, this is where reality TV, I just can't. Okay, the last thing that I'm going to talk about is I appreciated, for all the ups and downs, for all the contradictions or inconsistencies or what have you, Rachel did say she regrets it all. She said, I wrote some things down. She said, I would do everything different. I want to acknowledge that I let people down. I broke trust. I'm disappointed in my actions. I was hurting. And I'm going to work hard to make sure I don't ever put myself in this position again. She needed to get caught to hit rock bottom so she could change. And she'll never go back knowing it doesn't support her ultimate goals of being a wonderful person. And, Bethenny and Rachel talked about her, trying to be a cycle breaker. And so for me as a therapist, I'm just here for all of that. That is language that I'm sure she would have heard in therapy, in treatment, but to hear it and then to be able to, continue to discuss it and really take it seriously, I will give her credit and support for that. I think the world would be a better place if we all tried to work hard on our stuff to be the best version of ourselves that we can be. So at the end of the day, good for her, for doing that. She'll never come back to reality TV, which tells me that she's taking her mental health extremely seriously. And, she realizes it's not the best place for her to be. So good for her. I hope she heals. I hope she finds, what she's looking for and finds her happiness. And, she finds love and joy and all these great things that humans deserve. So those are my thoughts on that. Thank you so much to everyone for listening to, this very long part 2. And as always, I just want to thank everyone for the support. This is a new podcast and, people have been so supportive and so great. I appreciate you all so much. Please head over to my YouTube channel where you can see the video of this podcast. And, please subscribe to my YouTube channel and the podcast. You can also find all the links to any podcast I've ever done, including my own, on my Instagram page, which is Your Bish Therapist. So to close it out, what I'm going to do is read my disclaimer. And then we'll talk about a little bit what I'm going to talk about next episode. Disclaimer: posts are not intended to diagnose, treat, or provide medical advice. Your Bish Therapist is for entertainment and informational purposes only. The podcast, my opinions, and posts are my own and not associated with past or present employers, any organizations, Bravo TV, Greyheart Productions, or any other television network. The information in YBT Podcast and on its social media is provided for general informational purposes only and is not intended to diagnose or treat. Please do not act or refrain from acting based on anything you read, see, or hear on Your Bish Therapist podcast or associated social media. Communicating with Your Bish Therapist via email and or social media does not form a therapeutic alliance. Melissa, operator of Your Bish Therapist, is unable to provide any therapeutic advice, treatment, or feedback. Oh, sorry, that's a mouthful. So next episode, I am going to follow up about all of this after I get some of your feedback. And I plan to talk about some things outside of Bravo. I had some ideas to talk about the Murdaugh murders, and I've kind of been really obsessed with that. The whole situation with the Duggars, John and Kate plus 8. So I am definitely going to, in the next couple episodes, talk about some non-Bravo related things. But of course, if breaking news comes up, I will have to serve clinical interpretation. So thank you all for listening. Thank you all for watching. I appreciate you very much. Until next time, this is your Bish Therapist signing off. Bye-bye.